The air at the ridge was different that summer. It didn't just hang, it pressed against you, heavy with the scent of sun, baked pine, and the electric hum of a storm that refused to break. We were miles from the nearest paved road, tucked away in a cabin made of cedar and glass, the three of us. It was supposed to be a retreat, a weekend to celebrate 10 years of a marriage that had grown quiet, stable, and perhaps a little too predictable. I stood in the kitchen, the cool marble of the counter a sharp contrast to the heat radiating from the floor-to-ceiling windows. Outside, on the wrap-around deck, my husband, Julian, was pouring a second finger of rye for his oldest friend, Silas. I watched them through the glass. They were silhouettes against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. Silas was taller, leaner, with a restlessness that had always acted as a foil to Julian's grounded, watchful nature. I wasn't looking for the corkscrew, even though that's what I'd told them I was doing. I was looking at my own reflection, wondering when the woman in the silk slip dress had started feeling like a stranger to herself. Then, the screen door creaked. It wasn't Julian. I felt Silas before I heard him. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt smaller. He didn't say a word as he walked past me to reach for a glass, but his arm brushed mine, a lingering, intentional contact that sent a jolt of pure static through my veins. It wasn't the first time. All afternoon, while we'd hiked the lower trails and lounged by the gorge, Silas's eyes had been a constant weight on me. It wasn't a predatory look, it was a question. A dark, simmering, what if, that had been vibrating between us for years, never acknowledged, never acted upon. Until now. I looked out toward the deck. Julian was watching us. He wasn't moving. He didn't shout. He didn't even look surprised. He just stood there, his glass held loosely in his hand, his gaze fixed on me with an intensity that made my breath catch. There was no jealousy in his eyes, only a profound, terrifying curiosity. It was as if he were seeing me through a new lens, not as his wife, but as a woman capable of being desired by someone else. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't a betrayal. It was an invitation. The silence in the kitchen was a living thing. Silas reached out, his fingers grazing the strap of my dress. He paused, his hand hovering just above the skin of my shoulder, waiting for the word that would send him back to the deck or draw him closer. Julian. I whispered, my voice barely a tremor. My husband stepped toward the glass door, the golden light from the kitchen illuminating the sharp lines of his face. He didn't come inside. He stayed just on the other side of the threshold, a witness to the boundary we were about to cross. Don't stop on my account, Elara, he said, his voice a low, resonant hum. I want to see. I want to know everything you're feeling. The permission in his voice acted like a match to a fuse. Silas didn't hesitate. He hooked his thumb under the silk strap and slowly, agonizingly, slid it down my arm. I didn't pull away. I watched Julian's reaction. I saw the way his pupils dilated, the way his grip tightened on his glass. He wasn't losing me, he was reclaiming me through the eyes of another. This was the shift we'd been dancing around for months. The late, night whispers about boundaries, the confessions of hidden desires, the slow realization that our love was strong enough to withstand the heat of someone else's fire. We had spent a decade building a fortress. Now we were opening the gates just to see what would happen. Silas moved behind me, his chest a wall of heat against my back. His breath was warm against the sensitive skin of my neck. Is this okay? He murmured, his voice thick. I looked at Julian. He nodded, a slow, certain move and okay. Julian answered for me. It's exactly what we need. As Silas's hands found my waist, the world outside the ridge ceased to exist. There were no bills, no careers, no expectations of who we were supposed to be. There was only the rhythm of 3 heartbeats finding a new, synchronized tempo. The tension that had been building for years finally broke. But it didn't feel like a storm. It felt like a homecoming. Every touch felt magnified. The way Silas's calloused palms moved over the silk, the way Julian's gaze never wavered, anchoring me to the reality of our bond even as I drifted into the unknown. We were rewriting the rules of our intimacy in real time. It wasn't about the act itself, it was about the honesty of it. The vulnerability of allowing your partner to see you at your most primal, your most exposed. I've thought about this, Silas admitted, his voice a ragged whisper against my ear. Every time we grabbed dinner, every time we went on those cabin trips, I thought I was crazy for wanting this. You weren't the only one, Julian said, stepping into the kitchen finally. He didn't join us, not yet. He leaned against the island, a few feet away, watching with a reverence that made my skin tingle. I watched the way you looked at her, Silas, and instead of wanting to punch you, I wanted to thank you. For seeing her the way I do. For reminding me that she is a fire that can't be contained. The air was thick, charged with a heavy, sweet electricity. Silas's hands moved lower, tracing the curve of my hip. I closed my eyes, letting the sensation wash over me, but Julian's voice pulled them open again. "Look at me, Alara," he commanded softly. I did, and in his eyes I saw a reflection of my own liberation. We were past the point of no return. The what if had become what is. But just as the heat reached a fever pitch, just as the room seemed to vibrate with the sheer weight of our shared breath, the sound of tires on gravel shattered the moment. Headlights cut through the darkness, sweeping across the kitchen walls like a searchlight. We froze. The ridge was supposed to be private. No one had the gate code except us. Silas stepped back, his hands dropping to his sides. Julian straightened up, his face hardening into a mask of protective instinct. I pulled my strap back up, the sudden coldness of the room making me shiver. "Are we expecting someone?" Silas asked, his voice returning to its normal, grounded tone. Julian shook his head, his eyes fixed on the driveway. No one. He walked to the front door, his hand resting on the latch. I followed him, my heart hammering against my ribs for a very different reason now. Through the side window, I saw a sleek, silver sedan idling in the drive. The door opened, and a woman stepped out. She was dressed for a city lounge, not a mountain cabin. High heels crunched on the stones. Her hair was a dark curtain that caught the light as she looked up at the house. "Sienna." Julian breathed, his voice a mix of disbelief and something that sounded suspiciously like dread. I felt a cold pit form in my stomach. "Sienna. Julian's one that got away. The woman who had defined his 20s and nearly broken him before I ever entered the picture. They had stayed friends in that loose, modern way that always felt like a lie. She was a ghost that haunted the edges of our marriage, a name mentioned in passing but never invited to the table. What is she doing here?" I whispered. "I don't know," Julian said. But he didn't open the door. Sienna didn't knock. She stood by her car, looking at the house as if she could see right through the wood and stone. Then, her phone chimed in her hand. A second later, so did Julian's. He looked down at the screen. I caught a glimpse of the message. "I know you're not alone. I know what you're doing. Let me in." The atmosphere in the room curdled. The intimacy we had just built, the fragile, beautiful trust between Silas, Julian, and me felt suddenly exposed and ugly under the glare of Sienna's arrival. "This wasn't a coincidence. She followed us," Silas said, stepping up behind us. "Or she's been watching." Julian looked at me, and for the first time that night, he looked truly lost. The control he had exhibited, the pride he felt in our exploration, it was flickering. Sienna represented a past where love was chaotic, jealous, and destructive. She was the antithesis of the trust we were trying to cultivate. "Julian," I said, grabbing his arm. "Don't. I have to talk to her, Alara. She's not stable. If she's here, she won't leave until she gets what she wants." He opened the door. The mountain air rushed in, smelling of rain and exhaust. Sienna didn't wait for an invitation. She climbed the steps, her eyes scanning the three of us with a predatory gleam. She looked at Silas, then at my disheveled hair, then finally at Julian. "Quite a party," she said, her voice like silk over glass. I felt the heat from the bottom of the hill. "I thought I'd see if you needed a fourth." "You need to leave, Sienna," Julian said, his voice firm but strained. "This isn't your life. You don't belong here?" Sienna laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "Don't I? You spent years telling me I was the only one who truly understood your dark side, Julian. The only one who knew that stable was just a mask you wore for the world. And now I find you out here, playing games with your wife and your best friend. It looks like I was right all along. You're bored, you're starving, and you're trying to find a way to stay married without having to be a husband." She turned her gaze to me. "And you, Alara? Do you really think this makes you special? Do you think letting him watch you with another man makes you evolved? It just makes you a distraction. He's using this to avoid the fact that he doesn't know how to be enough for you." The words were venomous, designed to pierce the very foundation of the trust we had spent the night exploring. I felt the doubt creeping in, a cold shadow over the warmth I had felt just moments ago. Was she right? Was this just a desperate attempt to fix something that was fundamentally broken? I looked at Silas. He looked uncomfortable, like he had walked into a minefield. I looked at Julian. He was pale, his jaw set so tight I thought his teeth might crack. "You're wrong," I said, my voice gaining strength. Sienna arched an eyebrow. You think intimacy is about drama," I said, stepping forward until I was inches from her. "You think love is about being the only one who knows someone's secrets. But Julian doesn't have secrets from me anymore. Not tonight. What we were doing, it wasn't about boredom. It was about being brave enough to show each other every part of ourselves, even the parts that scare us. You're not here because you belong. You're here because you're a ghost, and you can't stand the fact that the house is finally full." Sienna's smirk faltered. She looked at Julian, seeking the old spark of obsession she used to command. But Julian didn't look at her with longing. He looked at her with pity. "She's right," Julian said. "You're a memory, Sienna. A loud, painful one, but a memory nonetheless. You weren't invited to this story, and you're not going to write the ending." He stepped back and took my hand, pulling me into his side. He reached out his other hand to Silas, who took it, forming a line of 3 against the one. "Go home, Sienna," Julian said. Before I call the ranger, for a long moment, the only sound was the idling of her car engine. The power dynamic had shifted. She had come here to shatter us, to use her knowledge of Julian's past to sow discord. But she hadn't accounted for the fact that we had already shattered the old versions of ourselves. We were something new now. Sienna spat on the porch, a final, petty act of defiance. "You'll get bored of each other eventually," she hissed. "And when you do, don't come looking for me." She turned on her heel, her heels clicking angrily on the stone as she marched back to her car. We stood in the doorway, watching until her taillights disappeared around the bend of the mountain road. The silence that followed wasn't the heavy, charged silence from before. It was clean. Julian closed the door and locked it. He leaned his forehead against the wood, exhaling a breath he seemed to have been holding for years. Silas cleared his throat, looking between us. "I should probably head to the guest cabin," Silas said softly. That was a lot. "No," I said, reaching out to stop him. "Don't go, not like this." Julian turned around. The tension from Sienna's arrival had been replaced by a deep, wary clarity. He looked at Silas, then at me. "She tried to make this about shame," he said. "She tried to make us feel like we were doing something wrong because it wasn't normal." "Is it normal?" Silas asked with a wry smile. "Who cares?" Julian replied. He walked over to me, taking my face in his hands. "Alara, when I watched him touch you, I didn't feel like I was losing you. I felt like I was discovering you all over again. I saw your power. I saw your pleasure. And I realized that my love for you isn't a cage. It's the ground we stand on while we reach for everything else." He turned to Silas. "And you? You're my brother. I trusted you with my life in the desert, and I trust you with my heart here. Tonight wasn't a mistake. It was a beginning." The air in the cabin began to warm again. The storm that had been looming all day finally broke, a torrential downpour drumming against the cedar roof, sealing us in. The sound was rhythmic, soothing, drowning out the rest of the world. We moved back into the living room, where the embers in the fireplace were still glowing a dull orange. The game, from earlier, had evolved into something deeper, something more settled. There was no more performance, no more uncertainty. Julian sat on the oversized leather sofa, and I sat between his knees, leaning back against his chest. Silas sat on the rug at our feet, his back against the sofa, his hand resting on my knee. It wasn't a scene from a movie. It was just us. "What happens tomorrow?" I asked, watching the rain lash against the glass. "Tomorrow, we drive back down the mountain," Julian said, his chin resting on my shoulder. "We go back to our jobs, our house, but we carry this with us. We know that the walls are only as high as we build them." "And Silas?" I asked. Silas looked up, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "I'll still be your friend. I'll still be the guy who drops by for Sunday dinner. But now, when I look at you both, I'll know that I'm looking at the strongest thing I've ever seen. You two didn't just let me in. You showed me what real partnership looks like. It's not about possession. It's about presence." We stayed like that for a long time, listening to the rain. The ridge had given us exactly what we came for, not a vacation, but a transformation. As the night wore on, the lines between us continued to blur, but never in a way that felt frightening. We explored the boundaries of touch and conversation, finding the places where friendship ended and something more profound began. We talked about the future, about how to navigate this new landscape of honesty. We talked about the fear that would inevitably come, and how we would face it together. When the sun finally began to bleed through the gray morning mist, the cabin felt different. The shadows were gone. The air was fresh, washed clean by the storm. We packed our bags in a comfortable, shared silence. As we walked out to the cars, Julian paused at the edge of the deck, looking out over the gorge. The river below was swollen and white with foam, carving its way through the ancient stone. "It changes the landscape," he said, gesturing to the water. "But the mountain is still there." I took his hand and Silas joined us, standing on my other side. We were a strange, beautiful trinity against the backdrop of the wilderness. "We're the mountain," I said. Julian smiled, a real bright smile that reached his eyes. He kissed me, a long, deep kiss that tasted of cedar and new beginnings. Then, he shook Silas's hand, a firm, meaningful grip. "See you back in the city," Julian said. "Count on it," Silas replied. As we drove down the winding mountain road, I looked at Julian in the driver's seat. He looked younger, lighter. He reached over and took my hand, lacing his fingers with mine. The story we had been writing for 10 years hadn't ended at the ridge. We had just finished the first volume, and as the trees blurred past and the world of the normal rushed to meet us, I knew that whatever happened next, we would write it together. Every word, every touch, every boundary broken. We weren't just a husband and a wife anymore. We were explorers. And the map was wide open.